This is a figure 4 snare. A lot of people think the figure 4 trigger is just for deadfalls, but what this is an alteration. Instead of having the weight, the trigger activated this way and having the entire thing collapse that way, the trigger is going to activate and this is going to go up, setting off the trap. The trap is this snare down here. It's been pegged up by 3 posts. You can put out a lot more, but 3 will do the job. There's 3 pieces to the actual trigger. There's the horizontal, or the bait stick. There's the upright, and there's the actual diagonal. Now on a deadfall trigger, the diagonal comes out here and goes down, and it's pegged down this way by a hook just like it is here, but then it's got its own hook pegging here. That holds it all in place, and pressure holds it all together. Whereas the exact opposite is happening here. Instead of downward pressure, it's upwards pressure. This thing wants to come up. The animal will come in, reach, and touch that, and get caught. Just like that. This is a treadle trigger. We already showed the figure 4 snare trigger. This is the treadle style trigger. And something that's got to be remembered is every single type of trigger like this, for the most part, can be modified to work with deadfalls, piercing traps, or impalement traps, and even nets, and quite a few other types of traps. The treadle works on the aspect of the animal stepping on it. Now, to try and convince an animal to get up and step on this, it's a little difficult. So one option is to set it blindly. Find a trail like the one that's behind me, and dig down into the ground until all these sticks are perfectly level and can be camouflaged and blend in with the ground. And by putting logs, just like we were talking about in the tracking, the animal will have to step on that if he wants to step over the log, and that'll set it off. Now this is going to require some fancy carving work. I have to cut in here, and pop that piece out so it's nice and flat. Carve this side flat, and then get a bar that can fit in between them snugly, and round the ends off it. If possible, burnish it by using a harder piece of wood, a rock, the edge of your blade, well not the edge of your blade, the face of the knife, your axe handle, anything like that. You just want to smooth this out. If you have sandpaper, even better. The more smooth it is, the more hair sensitive it is. Now the reason we cut this notch is we have a piece of wood that fits perfectly inside. Just like that. And the cord going up to the sapling is at the very top. We're going to use leverage to adjust this to make it work very well by taking that crossbar and pinning it down at the bottom. I can adjust it from this side as long as I keep pressure on that side. Nice and level, it's done. Now this is the actual trigger. This is all you need to know. Beyond that, you're just adding on because it's very difficult to make an animal stand on this. Whereas if I put a big space out there called a treadle, which is used in old-time woodworking, as well as modern trapping and primitive trapping as well, you set one of these treadles out from that bar. Now, some of them are shorter, some of them are longer, it doesn't really matter. Basically, these are going to be a little lever, and when the pressure is put on by an animal stepping on it, it's going to push this bar, this one here, down. When that happens, it's going to release this little bit of wood out of its socket, and it's going to go flying. So this is your trigger, that's your engine, the sapling, and your mechanism is a snare. Now, engine, mechanism, trigger are the 3 parts that you always need in a trap. Sometimes the mechanism and the engine are the same thing, like a log for a deadfall or a rock for a deadfall. Those are often your mechanism and engine in one, because it's gravity bringing down the weapon. Whereas with this, the snare is the mechanism. That's actually what's going to catch the animal. The engine is just simply what activates when the trigger is pulled. When the trigger is pulled, it activates the engine, and the engine does its job to close the trap. So, that's the setup. Here's the cord going from that little peg. And here's my snare opened up, doubled over. And again, we'll simulate it by simply stepping on it. And now it's got me caught. This is what's called a rolling snare or a running snare. It's a little lower than I'd like it to be. I'd usually have this bar about here, maybe a little higher. But this is good enough for an example. What this is a fence just to guide the animal to this opening. And in this opening we have a snare. It's about 1 finger to 2 fingers off the ground. It's about 5 fingers wide. A lot of people like to say 4 fingers. I add my thumb to include the whole fact that there's an ear there's ears that are going to be coming through this. It's pegged, you can see this snare, comes back to a peg, and we'll be showing that in more detail in a moment. And this is just a blind run. No baits, no lures, nothing like that. We just know where the animal is going to be frequenting. Now this is a human trail, but if this was a rabbit trail, it would be the exact same thing. The animal will run through and get itself stuck on that, and its shoulders will help close the snare on itself. And when it starts to pull, it just gets tighter and tighter while it fights until it can't breathe anymore, and then the animal will often stop resisting and just lay down. Now this is all the snare is. Just a piece of wire. It's got an eyelet twisted into it and a hoop. And it's approximately, what you do is measure just down to where your fingers can fit all inside. And I like to bend it. That way the snare's not going to want to ride up and get open. It's going to want to stay like this. That's approximately the size you want it. And the snare wire continues back to a stake. And this stake gets planted as deep as you can into the ground so it's got more support. But if you can put it behind a log, it's going to have to brace against that. And it's not going to want to move no matter how much the animal pulls on it. This one is the Canadian Ace, or the Flying Ace some people like to call it. And it's actually a portable takedown trap. These are all the pieces you need plus a sapling. You take them with you, and that's what you can do with a lot of traps. You make them in your base camp and you take them with you. And you can smudge them over a fire to get some smell of your scent off it. And a good idea is to actually put your hands in the ash of your fire and everything else to cover up your scent. And you can take these with you, go out to wherever you can find good saplings near trails, bait the stick, and set it together. Now this is the bait stick. It's also the basic trigger of this entire setup. And this one we actually smeared with bacon fat. There's little bits and salt and everything else involved just to make it really delectable. And it's cooked in. We used it while it was hot and dipped the stick in, so it's impregnated in the wood. It'll stay there for a while. Since it's grease, it's not going to wash off in the rain easily. And it's got two hooks on it. One here and one here. And this is going to be the actual stick that's attached to the sapling. And we got all these little notches cut in to tie it against the sapling flush. And there's one notch here facing down, just like this one's facing down. There's a chisel tip on the end. And that's going to hook in and connect with that one, and they're going to sit like that. And when it's set like that, you bring your sapling down with a cord attached to it, and this is attached to that cord around that notch. It's got two chisel tips on it. You simply spread it and set it. And that pressure holds it all together. I'm pulling pretty hard on the top, and it's staying together. If you don't know a good knot, make a bunch of knots. Not anything special. You can use constrictors to do this if you want. So that's the first step. Now we just need to set the rest of it. What we're going to do is use this cord, which is attached to this maple sapling up here. It's going to come down to the Flying Ace. And that is going to be attached to our toggle right here. I'm going to actually do a constrictor knot here and then just put a square knot onto the constrictor. And that's all it is. It's going to hold in place. I'm going to help the sapling. I'm going to ease it down. I don't want to just yank on it or else I'll break my cord. Or worse, the sapling. Let's see how that sets. Now the beautiful thing is, if you're making these things and reusing them, you don't have to fiddle with them so many times, because now that's been made once, you just got to keep making them better each time you use them. A bit more. Bring this around the cable so it can hang loose. And that's the trap. Now, if I was using snare wire, I could just have it, a big snare wire right there. And it would sit there without these fences. And I could actually have it out a little further. The animal has to stick his entire head inside to get to this. Or, of course, I could just put the bait right down here. But I like to have the tip hair sensitive, which is why I usually have my snares out a little further out forward and have a fence behind it. I like the tip having the bait because that makes it all that leverage. When you're working with traps like this, you're working with leverage and friction. If I just touch that, it catches around me much better now. And that's the Canadian Flying Ace or the Canadian Ace. So, this is the Klepsy trap. It's an impalement trap or piercing trap. Before I start getting into too much detail about how it's made and how you use it, I want to talk about the history of it because it's a very lesser known trap. Very few people know about it except for in historical context. This was used in the Arctic, whether it was in Canada, Alaska, Greenland, and even up in Siberia, especially in Siberia. And this trap was used specifically to catch fur-bearing mammals. It was used to catch fox, fisher, wolverine, wolf even. There's even claims that the larger version of this was used to catch bear, which in theory it could. It's using a much simpler technique than using a deadfall. What they would do is they would set it up, and there's a lot of variations they would use. This is the most simple one that can be made. More complicated ones can be made completely out of bone and sinew for the rope. And what it is a fulcrum point right here with a lever. And the lever has a spike on it. And this lever is put under tension by putting a rope around these two prongs of this fork stick, around and around and around and around, and this is placed in the center and twisted, just like this. Well, actually it's twisted this way, around and around and around until it's not able to be twisted any further. And then spikes were driven in, just like this bone spike here. Bone was the most commonly used one, though later on metal spikes were used. You could use nails even if you're making one yourself, and they were preferably placed more than one. This one only has one because we only had one piece of bone to work with. But several spikes could be driven in from here all the way up to here, and what it was a clamping trap that would pierce into the body. It's kind of like the old leg hold traps that people used to have with the teeth on them. And this is the trigger here. Now, this trigger is not the traditional trigger. In fact, I haven't been able to find out from all the research I've done what the trigger was. What this is a promontory peg deadfall trigger. And it works quite well. The promontory peg was found in Promontory, Utah, and George Mearshaw figured out how to make this thing work. And what it was, the trick is you can't use a cutting tool like a knife to make this trap. You have to use a saw blade or traditionally a piece of stone that was used. It would leave a much rougher surface, so friction holds this all together. And right up here on this bottom peg, it tapers. I'll let you see that a little better in a moment. And right at the very tip of it, right up in here, bait was placed in between the two sticks. And we'll come in, and this is why you want to have a bunch of spikes, not just the one, because this is way too high for that spike to actually hit. And we'll come in and just fiddle around with it, and it would come down and clamp him in. And now, you don't have to necessarily use the promontory peg. Another option is use a longer bar and have a cord that comes back, twisted around with the peg out here with another little stick, or all the way up, and you can actually use a Paiute deadfall trigger. You can also actually use these two braces, use this come back, and have one bar as your trigger stick coming back in a figure 4 manner. Anything will work as long as it keeps this thing open enough and trigger sensitive enough for that to happen. You need to be extremely cautious when you set a trap. Notice that whenever we're setting these traps that are spring pulls, we're keeping our heads out of the way. We're keeping our throats out of the way. We're keeping the majority of our body out of the way of whatever's going to be a moving object. Because that moving object might pull that bait stick, which is sharp, up with it. That sharp stick can now be just like a Klepsy trap. And even if it doesn't have that sharp stick, that little toggle that's coming up, well, that's a solid piece of wood. That hits you in the throat, or that hits you in the eye, or anywhere, it can cause a lot of damage. Traps are a serious tool. These aren't toys. So practice with them, but use extreme caution. And always use your best judgment.